Hello, everybody. This is Ed Goetz, University of Minnesota, and this video is the first of two on the nuts and bolts of fair share housing. I'll talk about some policy design issues and then go over a couple of examples, and then Professor Monkinen will look at the California example and sort of wrap things up for us related to fair share. So you already know a few things about fair share, about the origins of it in the 1970s, and a little bit about the largest fair share program, which resulted from the Mount Laurel case in New Jersey. We're going to talk not about origins, but really about the design of fair share programs and how they operate, using a couple of examples. So the first thing that you see, I hope, on the slide is a set of policy design decisions that are necessary to make when you are creating a fair share program. You obviously have to define the region. In most cases, this is metropolitan area, but it could be larger, it could be statewide, it could be smaller, it could be within a county, although that's fairly rare. Generally speaking, we're talking about metropolitan areas. Once the overall region is defined, you also have to decide what the subunits are going to be. Now, typically, this is municipalities within the region. But there are sometimes examples of larger divisions. We're going to, I'll show you one in a couple of minutes, which use something larger than municipalities. Even if you do identify municipalities, you probably also need to think about whether any exemptions are in order. For example, if you have urban growth boundaries, are you going to include communities outside the growth boundaries in your fair share? Are you going to include communities that are not sewered, et cetera? After that, you have to decide what it is that you are allocating in a fair share manner, right? Is it subsidized housing units, federally subsidized housing units? Is it something more general like affordable housing, which might also include private sector housing? And you also have to decide on level of affordability, whether you're looking at 80% of the median, maybe 100% of the median, or something else, right? So this question of what it is you are allocating needs to be determined as well. And then the meat of it is, of course, your definition of fair, how it is you are going to allocate these units across different municipalities within a metropolitan area. And this is usually formula-based, where a formula is created, you plug in certain characteristics of each municipality, and at the end, the formula spits out a number, which is a municipality's affordable housing obligation over a given period of time going forward. And there are several possible principles that could be incorporated into this part of your policy design. And some of the most common ones are listed there on the slide for you. The first one is kind of an equal allocation across units. Is every jurisdiction going to be responsible for the same units, or the same number of units? This is probably unrealistic given different sizes and different growth trajectories. So a proportional allocation is often used. That is, each jurisdiction is given an obligation that is proportion to its size in the region as a whole. Also, the inverse of the existing distribution of subsidized housing is common in fair share, right? Here, the idea is that you want to disperse the subsidized or the affordable housing in a way that is not currently reflected in the metropolitan area. After all, that is really the point of a fair share approach in most cases. But you should also think about the possibility of other policy objectives that might be incorporated into a fair share formula. And I'm thinking here of maybe jobs housing balance, that you want to perhaps take into account where jobs are or where job growth is taking place. You might think about transit-oriented development and so adjust your formula for for characteristics related to transit service. There may be other considerations that you have in mind. And I think, it's possible to be creative here. You are probably constrained only by availability of data in terms of thinking about the things that you might be able to incorporate into a fair share formula. And then finally, the last policy design decision that you have has to do with implementation, right? It's, are you going to include tools for each of the communities to build affordable housing? Are you going to incorporate systems of monitoring and accountability, compliance? What are the requirements related to compliance? Are there going to be sanctions for those communities that don't comply? Are there going to be incentives to get communities to meet their fair share goals, et cetera? So this is the range of common policy design questions. There might be others that are not on this list, but these are the ones that show up really most frequently when fair share is being created. And as I noted, fair share emerged in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, and the first examples of fair share are not overly sophisticated, but they're pretty interesting nonetheless. What you see in front of you is the Pueblo, Colorado metropolitan area fair share plan from the early 1970s. And there's a couple things you can see right away. First of all, they divided the metropolitan area into 4 quadrants. And so the subunits that were allocated a fair share were not municipalities themselves, but were these quadrants. This raises some interesting questions about implementation, such as how do you fix responsibility for units within the quadrants, and how do you enforce it? And it strikes me that it introduces a free rider problem of some size, but that's an interesting choice that they've made. Each of the columns, at least each of the first 6 columns, represents a principle of allocation that the Council of Governments there in Pueblo, Colorado, wanted to incorporate into the formula. The first one is simply the equal proportion. Each of the 4 quadrants would get 25% of the units. But the second column has to do with the number of existing housing units there. So it has to do with sort of size of the developments within each quadrant. The third category has to do with low and moderate income families. Here, this is kind of a demand consideration, meaning that you want to build the housing where those families live, because they're the families that will that are demanding this kind of housing, or that need this kind of housing as well. The fourth column might actually work at odds with the distribution principle of the third one, which is that the fourth one is the inverse of the current distribution of subsidized housing, right? So here, the Council of Governments wanted to change the current distribution of subsidized housing in an important way as well. And then columns 5 and 6 have to do with other characteristics of the population, where high-income families live and where minority families live as well. And finally, the formula itself is column 7, which is simply an average of the first 6 columns. That average is then applied to the number of units that are anticipated, the number of low and moderate income subsidized units that are anticipated in that region over the coming years. And then each of those quadrants gets a number. So in the Northeast quadrant, 451 units of subsidized housing would have been built or were assigned to be built to that quadrant. So that's one example. Let me give you another one quickly. This is the Twin Cities and their system in the early 1970s, which was in place for about 30 years, although really in operation only for about 10 years. That's another story that we'll get to. And their formula was a simple average of 5 different factors. 2 of the factors had to do with population. One being, where does the current population exist? And the second one being, where is the population growth going to happen? The next two factors are about jobs. Where are current jobs and where are the jobs that are coming? And then the last one is a kind of demand variable, which is the number of low mod households minus the number of subsidized units in each metropolitan jurisdiction. So this formula produced both a 10-year goal, which assumed full funding from the federal government to meet needs, but it was also translated into 3-year goals based on the best estimate of actual federal funding available. And so this is how the Twin Cities Metropolitan Council tried to implement this fair share approach. But again, as I said, that only was in operation for about 10 years. And they switched in 2006 to a more sophisticated formula that was in operation for about 10 years. And I want to focus on this one because it's the most complicated of the ones that I'll be talking about. And so let's go through it. It begins with a regional projection of what the overall growth is going to be in the metropolitan area. And the Met Council anticipated that between 2011 and 2020, that there was going to be 166,000 new households in the metro area. And they apportioned that to every city within the region as well. Then they estimated what proportion of all of those households were going to be low-income households. And they estimated that it was going to be 38%, or about 64,000 units. They adjusted that in two ways based on their perception of what the housing market does and how it operates. First, they thought that there was going to be a number of units that were going to filter down the marketplace and become affordable to low and moderate income people over time. And they assumed that that was going to be about 20,000 units. Then they also wanted to allow for a 5% vacancy rate. So they incorporated those two adjustments into the formula. And here's how they calculated regional needs. They began with the 64,000 new low-income households. They subtracted 20,000 for the number of units that they anticipated would filter down the market. They added 2,200 units in order to achieve a 5% vacancy rate. Then they added 5,000 more units because there was a built-in need for housing for homeless people in the metropolitan area as well. And that left them with a number, 51,000 units of low moderate income housing was going to be needed in the Twin Cities metro area in that 10-year period. So step 5 then was the beginning of how to apportion that need across metropolitan communities. This need was 30.6% of the overall regional growth. So the next step was to apply that percentage, 30.6, to the city level growth forecasts in each community. And this was the application of that principle of a uniform allocation, proportional allocation of housing need. From there, they took another step. They adjusted for low wage employment. For each community in the region, they calculated a ratio of low wage jobs in the community to the number of low wage residents. And where that ratio was greater than 1, where there were more jobs than residents, then the need would increase. And where the ratio was below 1, the need would decline. Step 7 was to make another adjustment. This adjustment was, again, to think about the inverse of the existing distribution of affordable housing units. So again, the idea was that we wanted to disperse them in a slightly different way. And so we're going to use the inverse of how they are currently distributed. Now you can see that perhaps step 6 and step 7 might work at odds with each other. But we can sort of discuss that later. Step 8 was an adjustment for transit service. The thinking here on the part of the Met Council was that many of these families that would occupy these low and moderate income units were going to need transit service. And so there was that adjustment made. And then the final adjustment was simply to reduce all of the numbers so that the total number of units allocated was 51,000, because it turned out that once you went through the first 8 steps, the total number of units was greater than 51,000. So they wanted to adjust for that. So what you have in front of you is the formula that, that was used for this period of time, incorporating household growth times the 0.306, and then incorporating the jobs wage ratio, the existing affordable housing, and the transit adjustment. Changes were made for the current decade. Some of the changes increased the sophistication of the model, and some actually decreased the sophistication of the model. Need is now calculated for 3 different income levels, as you see on the slide. But the transit adjustment, the homeless adjustment, and the 2 market adjustments, the filtering and the vacancy adjustments, have been eliminated from the formula. And so the Twin Cities now really has only a low-wage jobs to low-wage earner ratio adjustment, and then an adjustment for the existing distribution of affordable housing. And then finally, implementation. There's no enforcement mechanism in the Twin Cities approach. There are no sanctions for lack of enforcement. There are no tools available for local governments to build, or no new tools as part of this fair share approach for building affordable housing. The only thing that's in place is the creation of what the Met Council calls a housing performance score, which is relevant if a community wants to compete for a Livable Communities grant from the state of Minnesota. It's a fairly minor grant, and combined with the lack of enforcement, the lack of sanctions, I think you'll see that the back end of the fair share approach here in the Twin Cities is a little light. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Monkinen now, who will take you through the California example, so that you can compare and contrast these nuts and bolts of these 2 different approaches, and that we can speak more generally afterwards about how to put together a fair share approach. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the next video.